الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. So we've been looking at the rulings of the musafir and the issue of iqama and where you can have iqama. So he's pointed to, and he's going to break it down at the end, that you have the in a place you can in general you can be in one of three states. You could be a traveler, or you can be resident somewhere, or you can be home, right? وطن الإقامة and الوطن الأصلي, and we'll look at the وطن الأصلي in a second. So where can you become resident, right? He says رحمه الله تعالى ولا تصح, قال الإمام الشمولاني رحمه الله تعالى ولا تصح نية الإقامة في مفازة لغير أهل الأخبية. It is not valid to intend residence in a deserted place, right, for other than those who dwell there. لعدم صلاحية المكان في حقه, because for other than the dwellers of the place, that place is not fit for residence, right? والأخبية جمع خباء is tent dwellers, right? بغير حمزة, يعني مثل كساء وأكسية. بيت من وبر, right? It's a house made out of, what's وبر? Yeah, so like it basically, it's, so the khiba is like a tent. They'd make them with skins, right? And it's not if those who dwell in houses from skins, but because they would live in the countryside, right? Like, those who graze cattle and so on, right? أو صوف, or from wool. وَالْمُرَادُ مَا هُوَ أَعَمْ مِنْ ذَلِكَ, and what's meant is that which is broader than that, because الفقيه ينظر إلى المعاني. The fuqaha look at the ma'ani. It's not the fact that it's made of wool or leather. So what if someone lives in a plastic tent, right? No, like the consideration is it right? وَأَمَّا أَهْلُ الْأَخْبِيَةِ فَتَصِحُّ نِيَتُهُمُ الْإِقَامَةِ في الأصح في المفازة. As for those who live in tents, right? That's how they live, right? So nomadic people, right? Who live, like they may have. Why? Because they have the things they need to establish residence there. And they would be considered, when they stop somewhere, they are considered resident, right? But other than them, it's not accepted. There is another opinion that this is not valid, but that is a secondary opinion. Okay, that's why he mentions الأصح. ولا تصح نية الإقامة لعسكرنا بدار الحرب ولو حصروا مصرا لمخالفة حالهم بالتردد بين القرار والفرار. Right? It is not valid for our armies, meaning the armies of the Muslims, to intend residence in Dar al-Harb, right? Even if this is during battle, right? Even if they have laid siege to a town, because their state is a fluctuating state between remaining and fleeing. You don't know if you'll be able to flee, to remain, yani. Right? So that is ولا تصح نية الإقامة لعسكرنا بدارنا في حال محاصرة أهل البغي. And likewise, the intention of residence is not valid for our military, for the Muslim military, in our lands, Dar al-Islam, when they are laying siege to rebels, أهل البغي. للتردد كما ذكرنا, because of the same reason, because of the fluctuating state, right? ولو كانت الشوكة ظاهرة لنا عليهم, even if our army seems to be prevailing, right? حال الحرب ليس حال قرار, right? وإن اقتدى مسافر بمقيم, if a traveler follows a resident person, يصلي رباعية ولو في التشهد الأخير, a resident person who's praying a 4 rak'ah prayer even in the final sitting, في الوقت صح, in the time their following is valid, وأتمها أربعا, and the traveler completes the rak'ah as 4, تبعا لإمامه, even if you joined right at the end, right? Right? But if they invalidated the prayer, they'd make it up as 2, right? They would make it up as 2. واتصال المغير بالسبب الذي هو الوقت, right? ولو خرج الوقت قبل إمامه أو ترك الإمام القعود الأول في الصحيح, right? You completed 4, because the مغير, because the thing that changed your prayer, meaning from 2 rak'ahs to 4, came, bisabab, with the means, which is the time, right? Within the time, there's a cause for changing the prayer to 4 rak'ahs, which is that you're praying behind the imam, and this applies ولو خرج الوقت, ويفعل ذلك, and one does this, one completes it as 4 ولو خرج الوقت, right? قبل إتمامه, and one does this even if the time goes out before you finished it. Someone joined the imam for dhuhr prayer, a traveler joined people praying dhuhr right at the end of the time, they finished, right? He got up to make up what he missed of the prayer, time goes out, he finishes it as 4. And the same thing if the imam leaves the first sitting, right? According to sound opinion, right? Because, and this is problematic because for the would appear problematic because the sitting at the end of 2 rak'ahs is originally fard for the traveler, but by praying behind the imam, his final sitting would be considered like the final sitting of the imam. So by following behind the imam, that first sitting becomes like a wajib. And that's the fatwa position. Tahtawi mentions that. That's within the time, right? And part of this is because the athar and so on point to this as well. The hadith confirm this. within the time. Right? But after the time, we note that there are problems. وبعده أي بعد خروج الوقت لا يصح. After the exiting of time, it is not valid. اقتداء المسافر بالمقيم. For the traveler to pray behind a follower. Meaning, if both a resident person and a traveler missed a prayer, the traveler could not pray behind the resident person. ولو كان, what does it say? ولو كان إحرام المقيم قبل خروج الوقت. Even if the one resident gave the takbir before the exiting of time. If the follower started joining at the end of the time. So basically don't do it. Right? لأن فرضه لا يتغير بعد خروجه بعد خروج الوقت. Because the fard was, what is due upon you does not change when the time exits. Because within the time, right? What's the sabab? So there's two things. There's the sabab and there's the mughayyir. The sabab is the cause of the prayer. There's a little bit of detail here, which is the cause of the prayer in general is al-waqt. But for that prayer is the moment you started the prayer. That's the sabab. And then you have the mughayyir, which is that you're praying behind the imam. Right? But the mughayyir, the fact that you're praying behind the imam, can your fard change to 2 rak'ahs? From 2 rak'ahs to 4? Within the time it can. Why? Because the mughayyir is connected to a sabab, which is juz'un salihun min al-waqt. Right? The sabab is, within the time, the prayer is there's potentially, like, let's say Isha time came in. Why are we praying? In general, because like Isha becomes fard, generally because the time has entered. But what was the actual cause for praying? Was the was a moment of Isha time fit to start the prayer. And that's why Asr prayer is valid during the late time. But what happens once within the makruh time? But can you make qada there? No. Right? Now, for the traveler, so the mughayyir was attached to the moment you started, because the prayer was ascribed to the moment. Now, outside the time, the prayer is ascribed to the waqt as a whole. Right? And what was due upon you for that time? 2 rak'ahs. Where is the mughayyir that you're praying behind the imam? Outside the time. So, the fard la yataghayyar. Right? So, so these kinds of statements you have to unpack. لأن فرضه because the obligatory prayer of, whose obligatory prayer? Of the musafir. لا يتغير بعد خروجه بعد خروج الوقت. Because the fard of the traveler does not change. Why? Because he's already explained why, folks. Right? That's why we need to pay attention, right? Because in the first, like in preparing, if you don't have question marks about this, that what is the mughayyir, this and that, because in the first, they're already given the reasoning, why within the time, because the mughayyir, which is who's the mughayyir? Praying behind the imam. That mughayyir is connected to the time, which is, the waqt is the moment that you begin. The mughayyir is connected with the sabab, which is the waqt. But here the waqt means the moment that you began. Now once the time goes out, the mughayyir, you're praying dhuhr. But is the mughayyir connected to dhuhr? No. So you can't. But that's not the only reason. Right? Right? So here he leaves this part. So here لأن فرضه لا يتغير بعد خروجه لعدم اتصال المغير بالوقت. He's already stated that. It's called اكتفاء. Because in the first case, the fard changes. Why? Because the mughayyir, which is you're praying behind the imam, is connected to the time. But now after the time, it's not. Now this is the legal reasoning of it. Right? In the second, he doesn't mention the reasoning, but it's there because it's mentioned briefly. So here you could put لعدم اتصال المغير, when you could put because the changing factor, why would you change from 2 rakahs to 4, just praying behind the imam, is connected to the time of the prayer, to the time in which the prayer is conducted. Out of the time, you couldn't. There's a transmitted way too, لعدم ثبوته. But there's unstated legal reason for it as well. And where does the mughayyir come in? The qu'ud al-awwal is fard في حقه. Right? And he'll explain that. وبعكسه بأن اقتدى مقيم بمسافر صح. And the opposite is valid, such that if a resident person prays behind a traveler, صح الاقتداء فيهما. It's valid in both cases. في الوقت, within the time, there's no issue. وفيما بعد خروجه, and after the time exits. لأنه صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى بأهل مكة وهو مسافر. Because the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم led the people of Mecca in prayer while he was a traveler. وقال أتموا صلاتكم فإنا قوم سفر. Complete your prayers because we are a traveling people. Right, so the Prophet ﷺ did it. A traveler leading. But this is, of course, daleel for within the time, right? وقعوده فرض أقوى من الأول في حق المقيم. And the legal reason why this would be valid for the traveler to lead the resident even outside the time is the first sitting of the traveler is fard, which is stronger than the qu'ud of the resident person, because the first sitting is the final sitting for the traveler in a 2 rak'ah prayer, the prayers that are subject to shortening here. So the followers' first sitting is wajib, it's being built on a fard sitting for the resident, for the traveler. So for the resident person's first sitting is wajib, he's building it upon the traveling imam's sitting at the end of 2 rakahs, which is fard, because for him it's the qu'ud al-akhir. So you can build the less strong on the strong. But the opposite is not true, right? And here he is mentioned in brevity why the opposite can't happen. Because outside of the time, if a traveler prays behind a resident person, the first sitting for the traveler, what is it? Fard. He can't build that upon the wajib sitting of the traveler. But also the 3rd and 4th rak'ah Like if he got up for the third and fourth rak'ah behind the traveler, outside the time, you are mixing the nafil, because they count as nafil, because it's not part of his obligatory prayer. You're mixing a nafil into your fard qabla al-tamam, before its completion. Just as, which is not valid, just as in the issues related to the tashahhud, which you should have in mind. Did we not cover the sujood al-sahw? We haven't? We've never covered sujood al-sahw. They haven't covered in Nur al-Idah. We've covered it. The assumption is you know it. And if you got up for the fourth rak'ah without sitting for the tashahhud, right? And you prostrated for the fifth rak'ah, what would happen? Fourth rak'ah, without sitting to the extent of the tashahhud, you got up and you prostrated. What happens? What's nullified? No. Not quite. You got one thing wrong. One is just leave damirs out. The fard is nullified. The prayer is not nullified. Okay? So the same concept applies, right? That fard, now when the follower gets up, the traveler, if they're praying behind the follower, behind a resident person, the musafir, behind a muqim, when the muqim gets up for the third rak'ah, with respect to the traveler, this is nafil. But then where is his final sitting? Right? So that you're mixing a fard and a nafil before the fard is completed. So it's problematic. Now, outside the time, this remains problematic. Within the time, we can discern a reason, but we also have the texts. Right? And sometimes that's the other thing. Sometimes people say, the Hanafi fiqh is like falsafa. That's just because you're lazy. So it sounds like philosophy, right? It's just like if we're sitting at Seekers, nobody opened the blinds, whatever, and I'm describing the sun. Could there be something that big out there? Like, that sounds unreal. All you have to do is just step outside, beta, right? Right? So he says, Umar bhai, could you just take them outside? He says, that is the sun, right? So there's primary texts. Primary texts establish that you can follow, the traveler can follow the resident person within the time. Where will you find the texts that establish that that is clearly possible? And then there's a whole bunch of legal reasoning underlying it. Imam Shumbali just points to elements of it, and we've just explained it briefly, and it's come before when we looked in Nur al-Idah at Bab Sujood al-Sahw. If one didn't sit before the final sitting, etc. Okay. وَيُتِمُّ الْمُقِيمُونَ مُنْفَرِدِينَ بِلَا قِرَاءَ. Now, this is missed by a lot of people. That if, and you should annotate this, etc., because many people miss these kinds of masail. That's one of the, that here, وَيُتِمُّ الْمُقِيمُونَ مُنْفَرِدِينَ بِلَا قِرَاءَ. This is إِنْ اقْتَدَى مُقِيم بِمُسَافِر فِي رُبَاعِيَّة. If a follower, if a resident person prays behind a traveler in a 4 rak'ah prayer, right? يُتِمُّ الْمُقِيمُونَ. The resident people complete their prayer, meaning after the imam finishes at the end of 2 rak'ahs, because the traveler, if they lead resident people in a 4 rak'ah prayer, they pray imam prays 2 rak'ahs. The muqimun, the resident people, complete their prayer, because what's due on them is 4 alone. Right? They don't appoint someone to be their imam. Bila qira'ah, without reciting. Why? لأن واجب القراءة قد أدي بقراءة الإمام, because the required recitation has been completed by the recitation of the Imam. You say, okay, that's philosophical. No, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man kana lahu imam, فقراءة الإمام قراءة له." You prayed from the beginning of the prayer, the Imam's recitation is sufficient. So therefore, and of course, like as detailed as Maraqi al-Falah is, Maraqi al-Falah just Nur al-Idah just gives you the legal rulings. The Maraqi is now training you how to think, but that's not all you need to be able to think as a Hanafi, right? So the reasoning is far beyond this. So, but that's the underlying basis, just in brief. وَلَا سُجُودُ سَهُ. Why are we talking about sujood sahu? And there's no sujood sahu due upon them. Why would he bring in the sujood sahu here?
Because of the draw in the second and third rakah?
No. Good.
If they were to forget in the rakahs they're missing up, they went to sujood sahu because they're last one.
وَلَا سُجُودُ سَهُ. Because because by doing these rak'ah, why don't they have sujood sahu?
Because if the follower makes a mistake behind the imam, he doesn't do sujood sahu, and in this case, he in his ruling, if the imam has finished the prayer, it's as if he's just completing the prayer.
So what is the issue of why it would come up that they don't have sujood sahu upon them? One of the reasons is that you it looks like you left following the imam. Does it not? Imam gave, what's the ruling of the salam? You left the salam with the imam. Right? Is there a ta'khir of the wajib? So in this act there's no sujood sahu due, but also in this completing the prayer, you are like what's called the lahiq. Right? You're not a lahiq. The lahiq is someone who fell behind. You could visualize it, right? That within the time you entered the imam's prayer, the imam had 2 rak'ahs. You're allowed to enter his prayer, right? But you have these 2 rak'ahs to do. So when the imam gave salam, the qiyas would have been you would have given salam, but you have to pray 4 rak'ahs. So you have to do these 2 rak'ahs, right? Because your prayer is built upon the prayer of the imam. Correct? So when the imam gave salams, what were you supposed to do? In of itself, give salams, right? Right? But you can't give salams because you have 2 rak'ahs still to do because you're a resident. But these 2 rak'ahs, you need to do them. So this all arises from, you have to understand that Hanafis believe in first principles, right? The prayer of the follower is built upon the prayer of the imam. So you've entered in the imam's prayer, right? This is the imam's prayer, you began with him. The imam ends here at 2 rak'ahs. In of itself, you should have followed the imam, but you didn't because you have 2 rak'ahs left. These 2 rak'ahs that you have to do, you're completing what's due upon you in your following of the imam. So now the prayer you entered was the imam's prayer, correct? Your prayer is built upon the prayer of the imam. That's why in our madhab, can you separate from the imam's prayer? No. Like you can't make niyat al-infirad. Because in our madhab, لبناء صلاة المؤتم على صلاة إمامه. So it's built upon it. So when you entered the prayer, the Imam's endpoint was your endpoint, except that you have 2 rak'ahs left. But what is the qira'ah of the prayer? Whose prayer is it? Well, it's your prayer, but you're praying in the the prayer led by the Imam. So he's done the recitation. You have 2 rak'ahs left. So you are, while in one way you are munfarid min jiha, but another jiha, you are just completing the prayer you began behind the Imam. Right? You're not a latecomer. You started with the Imam. So it has some resemblance to the lahiq. In all of this, sajdat al-sahwi is not due upon you. For this. And because, but yet, you are a latecomer from another perspective, right? You are like a latecomer from another perspective. In what perspective? In that, in this prayer that you're performing, you're completing something after starting with the Imam. So you're like a munfarid in that perspective. So someone else can't build their prayer on yours. Why? Because your prayer was built on the prayer of the Imam. Right? So in that sense, you do resemble the latecomer. You're not a latecomer. You resemble him in that you're just completing the prayer, a prayer that you entered with the Imam. So someone wishing to pray behind you, your prayer is weak compared to their prayer, so they can't build the prayer on your prayer. Just like the masbook, the latecomer, can someone follow them? In our madhab, no. For the same reason. Because the hal of the masbook is weaker. And they cannot become imam because the state of the imam is qawi, because he's an asas. That's the legal thing. The others show us sufficient evidence for this, right? If you want to claim why, okay, you prove, give evidence. This is the ijtihad, but this is unpacked much later. So practically, when praying behind a traveler, we don't recite in the 3rd and 4th rak'ah. وندب للإمام بعد التسليمتين في الأصح وقيل بعد التسليمة الأولى أن يقول أتموا صلاتكم فإني مسافر. It's recommended for the Imam, yeah, after 2 salams, according to stronger opinion, and after 1 salam, according to another opinion, right? And the many people took this opinion of after 1 salam, given extent of confusion and so on, right? So there's leeway in it, right? You can see it in Hashid ibn Abdin. Okay. It's recommended for them to say, complete your prayers because I'm a traveler. Kama rawayna. You can say rawayna or ruwina. As we have related, inside the person's relating, or ruwina, as has been related to us. وإنما كان مندوبا لأنه لم يتعين معرفا لحال الإمام. And it's only recommended because this is not the only way that you know the state of the Imam. Why? لجواز السؤال قبل الصلاة أو بعد إتمامهم صلاتهم. Because it's also possible to have asked before the prayer or after the prayer about the state of the Imam. Or just to deduce it. You're praying Dhuhr, the Imam gave salams after 2 rak'ahs. Presumably a traveler. Right? وينبغي أن يقول لهم الإمام ذلك قبل شروعه في الصلاة لدفع الاشتباه ابتداء. And it's recommended, it's befitting. And ينبغي is usually used for recommendation. It's proper that the Imam say this, tell them that I'm a traveler before beginning the prayer to avoid confusion arising to begin with. ولا يقرأ المؤتم المقيم فيما يتمه بعد فراغ إمامه المسافر في الأصح. And the follower who's resident does not recite in what they complete after the completion of their traveling imam's prayer, according to the stronger of two opinions. Right? Now there is an opinion, right, that they can, right, 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 right. Someone gets confused. This is, there is leeway in it, and given that there's ikhtilaf in the other opinion has significant weakness and has been critiqued. This was chosen by Mullah Khusro in the Durar, right, or clarified by him, of the notable mutaakhirin, and the various commentators on the Durar explain it out, including Ashrumbulali. But given the confusion, so many people don't know, these are things that you have to be careful how to drop fiqh on people, right? People don't know. Like, honestly, you go to, some traveling scholar came, a whole bunch of people said, did you recite? No. They confuse them. Actually, if you ask them first, do you know the sunnahs of prayer? Do most of them know it? Frequently not, right? Especially one is between people who know, right? That's why the maratib of an-nas is important to know. The levels of people. There's a difference between between the unlearned and irreligious, and the unlearned and religious. Because the unlearned and religious is still unlearned, but they're a little bit different because they may want to do extra, but you have to treat them differently from the talib ilm. But the talib ilm who's a beginner is different from a talib ilm who has understanding and beyond. So you have to know how to deal with people. And the simple thing is, that's why suhbah is important, to see how you interface with people, right? And these things shouldn't confuse people about, especially after the fact, because they've already done it. Now what are you going to do about it, right? Especially when often people correct, okay, so what if I recited? I don't know. Why do you tell me then, right? Right? And he explains that لأنه أدرك مع الإمام أول صلاته, because they caught the beginning of the prayer with the Imam. وفرض القراءة قد تأدى, and the obligatory recitation has been fulfilled بخلاف المسبوق, as opposed to the latecomer, because they still have, because the latecomer is making up the beginning of their prayer with respect to recitation. Because the basic principle is, and there's a khilaf of ijtihad even within our madhab between the Imam and the Sahibain, that what did the latecomer catch, and what did they making up? What is they making up? What are they making up? Right? And the basic principle laid out about that by Imam al-Haskafi that summarizes the whole thing, right? Which in English you can say, you've caught what you caught and you make up what you missed, right? And that has implications, and we have an answer on seekers about that, but you can find the actual nas that's referred to there. It's useful to just to write it out and its implications, right? Then he says, وَفَائِتَةُ السَّفَرِ وَفَائِتَةُ الْحَضَرِ تُقْضَى رَكْعَتَيْن وَأَرْبَعًا فِيهِ لَفٌّ وَنَشْرٌ مُرَتَّبٌ. Right? A prayer missed when traveling, and a prayer missed when residents are made up as 2 rak'ahs and as 4 rak'ahs. So a traveler's prayer is made up as 2, and a resident's prayer is made up as 4 rak'ahs. And this is called laf wa nashr. Laf is when you put something together. I'm going to just take this. Put something together, and nashr is when you spread it. Right? Right? So you bring 2 things together. The laf, which is fa'itat al-safar wal-hadar, the missed prayer of travel and residence. Tuqda, then you spread it out, you put the ruling as 2 and 4. The laf and nashr can be murattab, when you mention 2 things in summary, and then you give their details. It's murattab when you mention A and B, and then when you spread out, you mention ruling of A, ruling of B. That's called laf wa nashr murattab. And when you do it in other than the order you mentioned, this is called laf wa nashr mushawwash. Right? And if he had said the missed prayer of travel and resident made up as 4 and 2, this would be problematic. Now, it's called mushawwash because it's ala ghayr al-tartib. Right? Mushawwash, it's ala ghayr al-tartib. Al-asl fi al-aqil, right? Like, and especially in our case, last night someone was really like frantically messaging me. I was like, what's wrong? Said the Imam said that tomorrow there won't be Fajr in the masjid, inshallah. And apparently a couple of followers got really mad at the Imam. Said, you can only say inshallah about good things. Are you happy that we're not doing Fajr tomorrow? Because there's lockdown in the UK. Said, who said you can only say inshallah? Inshallah it can also be said when you don't know what's going to happen. Right? Right? It's blameworthy to say inshallah if you're resolving to do something bad. Right? Now, was it the best way of putting it? Not necessarily, but it's not wrong. Right? But people like objecting, so these kinds of things, when explained to people that laf wa nashr mushawwash, you have to make clear, because say, oh, look, he put it in a wrong order. No. Because they may well be a malhaz. There may well be a reason why they're putting it in that order. Right? والأصل في تصرفات العاقل أن ترجع إلى أصل. The basis is an intelligent person would do something with a basis. Maybe you don't see it. Right? But at least you can say لعل وجهه كذا. It may be because of this reason. And especially because now like people like objecting to the ulama and everything. This is an important duty, right? To clarify it to people. There'll be a reason. Sometimes they mention A, B, and C because this is a logical order, but they'll begin with what's most important, right? And in logic they mention there's different reasons for ordering something. Right? There's a natural order for something. You mention A, then B, then C. And then you highlight first the most important thing. So that is technically laf wa nashr mushawwash. That is mentioning something brief and then detailing it in a mixed order. Anyways. What's the reason for this? لأن القضاء بحسب الأداء. Because you make up things as they were due. بخلاف فائتة المريض والقوي, as opposed to the prayer missed by the sick person and the strong person. فإن المريض إذا برأ يقضي بالركوع والسجود. Because the sick person, if they're healed, make up with ruku' and sujood. وإذا مرض يقضي بالإيماء. And if they're sick, they make up with head movements. So there are people who, for example, they got hospitalized for, they had knee surgery or whatever. If you're a religious person and you get sick and you have qada to do, you could pray with head movements. Right? And you're clearing what's due on you as بقدر الوسع. Right? Because there the issue is التكليف بقدر الوسع. There's 2 separate principles, right? The qada بحسب الأداء, sometimes say القضاء يحكي الأداء. The qada follows the أداء. But a separate issue of moral responsibility, extent of ability. Right? So if you are right? وإذا مرض فإن المريض إذا برأ يقضي بالركوع والسجود. Because the sick person, if they heal, they make up with ruku' and sujood. وإذا مرض يقضي بالإيماء. And if someone becomes sick, they make up their prayer with head movements. فأيتت الصحة. Even the prayers they missed when? لسقوط الركوع والسجود بالعذر. Because the ruku' and sujood with respect to the sick person, meaning the sick and therefore unable to make ruku' and sujood, have an excuse. وَلِلُزُومِهِمَا بِالْقُدْرَةِ. And because they're required from one in accordance with one's ability. بِالْقُدْرَةِ, which is al-qudra al-mutayassara, with the strength that one is able to have. بِقَدْرِ الْوُسْعِ. Right? The qudra is بِقَدْرِ الْوُسْعِ. To the extent of capacity. حال القضاء, when making it up. Right? Because let's say someone has knee trouble, for example, right? At this moment, let's say someone has prayers to make up. They're in their dhimma. At this moment, they have to clear the due, and our merciful Lord has given it. لا يكلف الله إلا وسعها. At this moment, this debt is due. How is it due? بقدر الوسع. That's rahmah in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we can clear that due بقدر الوسع. But what is considered the wusa? There are a lot of considerations in usul, because it depends on. That's why they discuss the issue of the awarid al-taklif. There's many different types of things that affect capacity. Right? Affect our moral capacity. Right? And each affects it differently. And then he tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, about the والمعتبر فيه أي لزوم الأربع بالحضر والركعتين بالسفر آخر الوقت. And what counts with respect to requiring 4 rak'ahs when being resident, or 2 rak'ahs as a traveler, is the end of the time. فإن كان في آخره مسافرا صلى ركعتين. If one is at the end of the time a traveler, one prays 2 rak'ahs. وإن كان مقيما صلى 4. And if one is resident, one prays 4 rak'ahs. لأنه المعتبر في السببية عند عدم الأداء فيما قبله من الوقت. Because it, what is لأنه? Because it, what is the it here? آخر الوقت. Right? And basic thing, folks, don't assume, like when you read, put arrows, unpack the damirs, because it's a simple way of erring. Fiqh is, the ulama write with subtlety. That's why the classical books, they do this. They're also saying, one of the wisdoms in it, they train a student that, look, every damir, unpack it. The mashayikh would say, just put arrows, each of the damair, what you're sure, but write them, they would say write them in pencil, until you become sure, right? If you're hesitant. Sometimes it's obvious, if you get used to it, use a pen, right? When you're not sure, you put a question mark, right? So they say, what did you put on this damir? Because you either unpack the damir, or you speculatively unpack the damir, or at the very least you put a question mark. If you didn't do any one of the 3, then are you a talib ilm? Because لم تطلب شيئا. Because the optimal talib is the one who uncovers meaning before they come to class, or at least they try, or at least they recognize the adaf al-ahwal, the weakest state. Say, I don't know what this is, right? But to come in a blank slate, so my mouth is open. Put knowledge in me, is not لا يليق بطالب العلم. لأنه أي آخر الوقت, because it is the end of the time that is considered with respect to obligation, to causation. عند عدم الأداء فيما قبله من الوقت. In terms of the cause of obligation, if one hasn't done it yet, right? And this is a broad principle. إن كل ما الأصل عند الإمام يعني أو الأصل عندنا أن ما تعلق بالوقت فالعبرة فيه بآخره. The basis is that which relates to the time. What counts is the end of the time, right? Right? Because the time is ticking moment by moment, right? So let's say Dhuhr time entered. You're a traveler. So when it entered, right? Why do you have to pray? Generally because of the time. But specifically is the moment, right? So you began Dhuhr time as a traveler. What is due upon you? A traveler's prayer. But then the moment you became, but let's say Asr comes in at 3, at 2:50 you became resident. Right? So now what's due upon you when you became resident? 4 rak'ahs. Right? Before you were a traveler, you now became resident. You're like, Alhamdulillah, I reached town, and you're like, Alhamdulillah, and you drove into a wall. Right? And you're unconscious the rest of the 10 minutes. But it wasn't too bad. You just momentary loss of consciousness. At Asr time, what do you have to make up? Right? So he explains, right? That, you can reread the expression to understand that, right? Then mu'tabar fi sawiyya عند عدم, if you haven't done it already, then why? Because every moment this prayer is due. Once you become resident, then this is what becomes due, or the opposite. Right? So you have to, فَتَلْزَمُهُ الصَّلَاةِ لَوْ صَارَ أَهْلًا لَهَا فِي آخِرِ الْوَقْتِ بِبُلُوغٍ وَإِسْلَامٍ وَإِفَاقَةٍ مِنْ جُنُونٍ وَإِغْمَاءٍ وَطُهْرٍ مِنْ حَيْضٍ وَنِفَاسٍ. And that's the same reason why prayer is due upon the person who became fit to pray before the end of the time. في آخر الوقت أي قبل آخر الوقت. Right? Before the end of the time, by hitting puberty. Or they became Muslim. Or they awoke from, they regained their senses after loss of sanity. They regained their sanity after loss of sanity. Or they regained consciousness after loss of consciousness. Or they became pure with the conditions of it from hayd or nifas. In each of these cases, what is due? Prayer becomes due for the same reason. Because it's not the beginning of the time. Because when the time enters, that act is generally due. But when do you do it? It goes moment by moment, right? Right? So, because what's in the dhimma changes. Right? Because prayer time entered, prayers enters your dhimma, you have to perform it. But then, by moment, the moment you become a traveler, what's in your dhimma changes. And once it changes in your dhimma, that's what remains. Right? So what would count is, at the end of the time, what was your state? Because that was what was within your dhimma that you had to deliver. And then he tells us about the awtan, the 3 types of place. Watanul asli, and watanul iqama, and a mawdi'u safar, and a place where you're a traveler. So we'll look at that Next, وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
There's just one more expression.
Sorry, did I miss something?
Bottom of page 17.
عفوا, sorry. وتسقط بفقد الأهلية فيه بجنون وإغماء ممتد ونفاس وحيض. And the prayer is lifted from the person who loses their capacity before the end of the time, such as Nasarullah al-Afiyah, by loss of sanity, or unconsciousness that remains, right? The mumtad, which is that lasts more than a day. Right? So someone, let's say Zubair, got a call from Uncle Jamil, Beta, you can marry my daughter. He got so excited, he ran without looking and ran into the wall. Isha had come in, lost consciousness, right? But the loss of consciousness lasts more than a day. He lost consciousness during Isha time, correct? Yeah. Would he have to make up that Isha? No. Well, we find out if the ighma lasted more than a whole day, and there are two opinions within the madhab, right? But the fatwa position is, and both are musahhah, but the fatwa position is that one would be absolved from that. Would he have to do that Isha prayer because the time had come in? No. But let's say happened to to me, you get local anesthetic, whatever, you'll be unconscious for 5 hours, let's say, but dhuhr time is in. That's not ighma mumtad. At the end of the time, you have an excuse from not praying, but that would have to be made up, right? Right, because the ighma, loss of consciousness, lifts responsibility of making it up if it lasts. So if you're just, let's say dhuhr comes at noon, 1 o'clock you go into surgery, and you're going to be unconscious for 6 hours. So dhuhr, asr. Now the caution would be, do dhuhr before you go into surgery, because the time is in, right? The others, your excuse, because beginning to end of time, your excuse in terms of there's no sense of account. Nobody would say you're accountable, but there's khuruj min al-khilaf, because in the other, if the time came in, you should have prayed before. And of course, the prayer of the unconscious, that comes up separately, right? Same like a pregnant woman, if she wants to be cautious, right? Like during delivery, that she's sure that the time is going to come in, that the time is going to come in. The child is coming out before the end of the time. A religious person would want to get another prayer in. So do your fard before the child comes out. Although if the child comes out at the end of the time, does she have to do fajr? No, because al-ibra bi akhir al-waqt. But time came in, you're able to pray. If someone does it, it counts as a fard, even though after the fact you weren't responsible for it. You meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with one extra prayer.
Someone flies out from the east to the west, and the first time enters, leaves, and enters again. Do they have to repeat the prayer?
There's khilaf on this. Actually, in the Qadaya Fiqhiyya Mu'asira of Mufti Taqi, he discusses this. And other ulama have discussed this. There is one group of contemporary, and the ulama did discuss this theoretically in the past. If this happened, what if you went up on a hot air balloon, for example, or something like that, right? So one case is that, okay, the sabab of the prayer is dukhulul waqt. So if the Maghrib came in, you prayed. But then you went up in the air, Maghrib went out, Like, you know, it was still Asr, Maghrib came in again. دخول الوقت السبب للصلاة. You have to pray Maghrib again. That's a credible opinion. It has its reasoning. The other opinion is that we know that there's 5 prayers in a day. So in that case, if you've prayed your Maghrib, you've done it. And that would appear, that legally would appear to be the more balanced opinion. Okay? That's what they give fatwa on. If someone wanted to pray it again, there's a reason for it. But it also puts people in, because you tell common people that, they get confused. And it does happen. Right? Especially if the flight's leaving right around Maghrib time. You pray, you go up in the air, time is in. No. If you've prayed, you pray. But if you want to make it up, you can make it up. Like caution. There's a reason for the caution.
If the imam is a traveler praying Rubai, let's say Dhuhr, and a resident latecomer catches the imam's second rak'ah, in the rak'ahs that he makes up, 2 to 4, how many of them does he recite?
1. Okay.
You looked at the case where someone doesn't intend and stays for multiple years, they don't intend to be resident. Does this mean that in order to intend to be resident, one has to intend to stay for 15 more days? Because otherwise they would already know that they have already stayed for 15 days.
It's a good question. So when Mufti Taqi was in Jordan, he got sick. So one of my friends said, look, he's sick, just have mercy on him. I said, you have mercy on him. Right? So we got a key to it. He said, okay, let's just ask him questions when he's like up and vigorous. I said, look, until the asl is, he's given us permission to ask questions. You have shak, wal yaqeen la yazul bi shak. We're going to ask questions until he either falls asleep or he requests no more questions. So I'm not going to ask. So good, let me ask. So we prepared for weeks for that lists of questions, mainly in fiqh, but also in hadith, because one of my partners in crime, Shaykh Ahmad Snowbar, is largely interested in hadith and also in contemporary issues and other matters. But then when we really tired, he says, be very nice. So he said, Jawabul Alili Alil. Right? Alil, the one who has a illa, can refer to the sick person. Jawabul Alil Alil. The answer of the weak is weak. So, but several times, may Allah bless him, he actually, he said, Ma huwa su'al? He sort of shake his head, and several times I got a big elbow from Shaykh Ahmad Snowbar. Like, Shaykh, I was like, when it's raining, you bring out the buckets, right? Like, what do you do? Right? Anyways, Allah Ta'ala. Allahumma shfihi wa'afi. He's still very sick, apparently. So we'll stop there, inshallah. What I would suggest, there's 2 books, right? You guys requested them before. Take one take the Radd al-Muhtar, the other, you